Snow fell in thick flakes over Manhattan, blanketing the city in a pristine white coat that masked its usual grime and chaos. Inside the Renaissance, New York's most exclusive fine dining establishment, crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the marble floors. Champagne flowed freely as Manhattan's elite clinked glasses celebrating another charity gala where they could feel virtuous while spending more on dinner than most people earned in a month. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Outside, homeless people huddled in subway entrances, seeking shelter from the biting cold. Inside, women with diamond earrings worth small fortunes complained about the temperature of their soup. Elena Vega wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, tucking a strand of dark hair back into her neat bun. 32 years old and exhausted after 6 hours on her feet, she checked her watch, 4 more hours to go. As the night manager, she typically supervised from behind the scenes, but tonight they were short-staffed. Serena, one of their best servers, had called in sick, leaving them scrambling. The Renaissance couldn't afford anything less than perfection, not with a guest list including 3 senators, a dozen CEOs, and Charles Harrington, the real estate mogul whose Harrington Development Group was reshaping New York's skyline. Elena moved between tables with practiced grace. Her white button-down shirt and black slacks were impeccable, her posture perfect. Years of training had taught her to be practically invisible, present when needed, a ghost when not. She caught the eye of Marcus Kingston, the general manager, who nodded toward table 7 with a sharp gesture. The Harrington table. Great. She'd been avoiding it all night. Brandon Harrington's reputation preceded him. At 27, the heir to the Harrington fortune was notorious for his behavior entitled volatile and perpetually intoxicated. Tonight was no exception. His cheeks were flushed, his movements sloppy as he gestured with a half-empty whiskey glass. Surrounding him were 4 equally privileged young men in bespoke suits laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Elena approached with a professional smile. The bottle of Dom Perignon was heavy in her hands. Brandon's eyes slid over her, lingering inappropriately before his lips curled into what he probably thought was a charming smile. Finally decided to grace us with your presence. Those other servers weren't nearly as pretty. Elena maintained her smile, feeling her skin crawl. She'd faced worse in her 12 years in the restaurant industry. She focused instead on pouring the champagne perfectly, the pale liquid cascading without a single bubble breaking against the glass. Charles Harrington sat at the head of the table, engrossed in conversation with another businessman. He didn't even glance in her direction. Unlike his son, Charles carried himself with calculated restraint. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his Tom Ford suit tailored to hide his slight paunch. At 58, he commanded respect with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. He had built the Harrington Development Group from a small family business into a real estate empire valued at $2 billion. Brandon leaned closer to Elena, his breath reeking of alcohol. So what time do you get off tonight? We're heading to Vortex after this. You should join us. No, thank you, sir. I'm working late tonight. Would you like anything else with your champagne? Brandon's eyes narrowed slightly, unused to rejection in any form. At least give me your number. I could show you places much nicer than this. I'm sorry, sir, that would be against company policy. Would you prefer if I sent another server to your table? A flash of anger crossed Brandon's face, quickly replaced by a forced smile. His friends exchanged glances, sensing the shift in his mood. One pulled out his phone, angling it toward them. You know who my father is, right? Of course, sir. Mr. Harrington is a valued patron. Elena kept her voice neutral, though her heart rate had accelerated. This was turning dangerous quickly. She'd seen that look before on entitled customers, the moment when they realized someone beneath them socially had said no, and they couldn't handle it. Brandon's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist as she tried to step back. I don't think you understand. When I ask for something, people say yes. Elena froze, acutely aware of the 5 sets of eyes on her, the phone recording, and Charles Harrington still oblivious to his son's behavior. The room seemed to narrow, sounds becoming distant. Please let go of my wrist, sir. I need to attend to other tables. Brandon's grip tightened momentarily before he released her, a cruel smile playing on his lips. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Brandon reached for his glass, not the champagne she just poured, but his cocktail dark with whiskey and cola. With deliberate malice, he tipped it forward, splashing the contents directly onto her white shirt. Cold liquid soaked through the fabric, instantly staining her chest and stomach. Ice cubes clattered to the floor. The room didn't exactly fall silent. The gala was too loud for that, but nearby tables noticed conversations pausing as heads turned. Brandon's friends erupted in raucous laughter, one still filming, another slapping the table in amusement. Oh God, my bad. So clumsy after a few drinks. Elena stood frozen humiliation, burning through her more intensely than any anger. The dark stains spread across her chest, liquid dripping onto her slacks. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Years of practiced professionalism evaporated in that moment of pure degradation. Charles Harrington finally looked up, taking in the scene. For a brief second, Elena thought she saw disapproval in his eyes, not directed at his son, but at the disruption. Then he simply turned back to his conversation, dismissing the incident entirely. Someone needs to learn how to take a joke. Brandon's words cut through her shock. Elena finally managed to step back, grabbing a napkin from a nearby service station. Her hands trembled slightly as she dabbed ineffectually at the spreading stain. Marcus Kingston appeared at her side, his expression tight. "Ms. Vega, a word please." Now he gripped her elbow, steering her away from the table and through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The bright fluorescent lights were jarring after the dimly lit dining room. Staff paused in their work, staring at her soaked shirt and Kingston's thunderous expression. "What the hell happened out there?" Kingston's voice was low, controlled fury. Elena still felt numb, processing the public humiliation. "Mr. Harrington's son deliberately poured his drink on me after I refused to give him my phone number." Kingston's jaw tightened. "Do you understand who the Harringtons are? That man at the table is responsible for half our corporate events. His developments host 3 of our sister restaurants. Are you saying I should have given him my number? Don't be obtuse. I'm saying you should have handled it better. You must have said something to provoke him." Elena's shock gave way to indignation. "I said nothing inappropriate. He grabbed my wrist. He poured a drink on me. On purpose." Kingston rubbed his temples, clearly calculating financial implications rather than concerning himself with her dignity. "Go clean yourself up. Then I need you to go back out there and apologize. Apologize for what being assaulted, for whatever misunderstanding occurred. Make it right, Elena. Your job depends on it." Elena stared at him, a decade of similar indignities flashing through her mind. Every time she'd been expected to smile through harassment, to apologize for boundaries, to value customer satisfaction over her own humanity. No, the word came out quietly but firmly. Kingston blinked, not comprehending at first. "Excuse me, no. I will not apologize to someone who assaulted me. I don't care who his father is. Elena, be reasonable. This is your career we're talking about." "Then I quit." She removed her name tag, placing it on the stainless steel prep table with a small click that somehow echoed in the sudden silence of the kitchen. Young Miguel, a line cook who had always been kind to her, stood wide-eyed near the door, his phone partially hidden behind a stack of plates. "I may not be rich, Marcus, but I have my dignity. No job is worth what just happened out there." She turned and walked toward the staff area, aware of the stares following her. Kingston called after her, his voice rising with panic. "You walk out. Now you'll never work in fine dining in this city again. I'll make sure of it." Elena didn't respond. In the staff bathroom, she locked the door and finally let herself look in the mirror. Her white shirt was ruined, the dark stain covering most of her chest. Her carefully applied makeup was intact, but her eyes reflected something she hadn't seen in years, the raw vulnerability she'd worked so hard to overcome since arriving in America. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Gabriel. "How's your night going, Amor?" "Still on for late dinner." Elena stared at the message from her husband, tears finally welling in her eyes. Gabriel Vega, CEO of Taste of Legacy Restaurants, the man who had built a culinary empire from nothing, the man who had fallen in love with her when she was just a waitress at his first restaurant 8 years ago. The man who had no idea what had just happened to her. She couldn't tell him. Gabriel had left behind his old ways, had promised her he would never return to that life. But Elena knew what lived beneath his carefully cultivated exterior. "If he found out about tonight about Brandon Harrington." "Fine, Sichuan. See you at home after midnight. Love you." She typed the lie with trembling fingers, then changed into her street clothes. The soiled uniform went into a plastic bag, evidence of her humiliation. As she left through the back entrance, snow still falling heavily, Elena had no idea that Miguel was already uploading the video, that by morning she would become the unwitting symbol of class warfare that her private humiliation was about to become devastatingly public. Across town in a sleek office overlooking Central Park, Gabriel Vega reviewed the quarterly reports for his restaurant empire. At 45, he cut an impressive figure, 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, in the physique of someone who still found time to exercise despite running a multi-million-dollar business. His olive complexion and dark eyes revealed his Italian heritage, while the silver at his temples added distinction rather than age. The floor-to-ceiling windows of his office showcased a panoramic view of Manhattan blanketed in snow, the lights of the city glowing through the white haze. On his desk sat a framed photo of Elena, her smile radiant against the backdrop of the Italian coastline where they'd spent their honeymoon. Another showed them together at the opening of his 10th restaurant, his arm around her waist, her eyes looking up at him with pride and love. Gabriel checked his watch, 11:30 p.m. Elena would still be at the Renaissance for another hour. He had built Taste of Legacy into New York's most successful restaurant group, with 18 establishments ranging from casual bistros to exclusive fine dining. The Renaissance was their crown jewel, a Michelin-starred restaurant that catered to New York's elite. Though technically owned by his company, Gabriel rarely visited anymore, trusting the day-to-day operations to managers like Kingston. His phone rang. Mike Russo, his right-hand man for the past 15 years. Unusual for him to call this late. "Mike, what's keeping you up at this hour?" Gabriel's voice carried the faint traces of his Bronx upbringing, smoothed by years of elocution lessons, but never fully erased. "Boss, we might have a situation developing. You need to see something." Gabriel's posture shifted imperceptibly, his body tensing. "What kind of situation?" "A video. Just hit social media about 20 minutes ago. It's from the Renaissance Tonight's charity gala. And it's Elena, boss." The temperature in this room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Gabriel's grip tightened on the phone. "Send it to me. Now." His phone buzzed with the incoming message. The video was shaky, clearly taken surreptitiously, but the content was unmistakable. Elena approaching the table. Brandon Harrington's inappropriate advances. The deliberate spilling of the drink. The laughter. Charles Harrington's indifference. Elena standing there, dripping and humiliated. Gabriel watched it once, twice, a third time. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a darkness rising from depths he had promised Elena he would never revisit. "Who took this Miguel Garcia?" "Young cook at the Renaissance. He's my cousin's kid." "Is it public, going viral as we speak?" "Already picked up by a couple of those Eat the Rich social media accounts." "Has Elena seen it?" "Don't think so. Kingston made her leave after she refused to apologize to the Harrington kid. She quit on the spot." Gabriel closed his eyes briefly, a muscle in his jaw pulsing. "Find out everything about the Harringtons. Everything. Their businesses, their properties, their finances. I want to know what they own, what they owe, who they owe it to. Every contract, every permit, every loan." "Boss, are you sure that's everything, Mike? And I want it by morning." Gabriel ended the call, turning to stare out at the snow-covered city. Memories surfaced, memories he had buried for Elena's sake. The young Gabriel Vega, son of an Italian immigrant construction worker. The teenager who had become the muscle for the Rossi family, breaking legs and collecting debts. The young man who had decided to leave that life behind, channeling his intelligence and drive into legitimate business. He had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Taste of Legacy wasn't just a restaurant group, it was his redemption, his proof that he could build something honest and good. Elena had been part of that journey, loving him despite knowing glimpses of his past. She had made him promise to leave that world behind forever, and he had kept that promise. For 10 years, he had been nothing but a successful businessman, a loving husband, a respected community leader. But watching that video, seeing Elena treated like she was nothing, seeing the casual cruelty of privilege, awakened something he had thought long dormant. Gabriel pulled out his private phone, the one whose number was known to only a select few. He scrolled through contacts rarely used and pressed call. "Anthony, it's Gabriel Vega. I need a favor." "Yes, it's been a long time, I know. Listen carefully. I need information on Harrington Development Group. Every project they're currently working on." "Yes, that Harrington. I particularly need to know which of their suppliers and contractors might have connections to our old friends." "No, I'm not explaining over the phone. Just get me the information." Gabriel ended the call and turned back to the cityscape. Below him, New York continued its nocturnal pulse, unaware that one of its most successful businessmen was remembering skills he had spent a decade trying to forget. He would not break his promise to Elena. Not technically. There would be no violence, no crude intimidation tactics. But the Harringtons were about to learn that in New York, true power often operated in shadows, and some insults couldn't be washed away with champagne and apologies. Elena arrived home to their penthouse apartment overlooking the Hudson River just after midnight. She had hoped Gabriel would be asleep already, giving her time to process what had happened. Instead, she found him in the kitchen, 2 glasses of red wine on the counter, a simple pasta dish keeping warm on the stove. "You're still up." Her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. Gabriel studied her face, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to wait for you. Thought you might be hungry after your shift." He didn't mention the video, didn't ask why her eyes were rimmed with red or why she had changed out of her uniform before coming home. Elena felt a surge of relief mixed with guilt. She hated lying to him, but telling him the truth would only unleash something she had spent years helping him contain. Elena moved to kiss his cheek, accepting the glass of wine he offered. The normalcy of the ritual steadied her. Their late-night dinners after her shifts had been a constant throughout their marriage. Gabriel served the pasta, a simple cacio e pepe, that reminded her of their first date when he had cooked for her in his modest apartment long before his restaurant empire had expanded. How was the gala? Fine. Same as always, rich people congratulating themselves on their generosity. Elena focused on twirling pasta around her fork, avoiding his gaze. Gabriel took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving her face. "Anyone interesting attend the usual suspects? Some politicians? Business leaders?" The Harringtons, Elena's fork clattered against the plate. She looked up to find Gabriel watching her intently, his expression still carefully neutral. "You know, the video is everywhere, Elena." She set down her fork, appetite gone. "I was going to tell you, I just needed time to process it myself." Gabriel nodded slowly, his hand covering hers on the table. His touch was gentle, but Elena could feel the tension radiating from him. "What happened after the video ended? Kingston told me to clean up and apologize to Brandon Harrington. I refused and quit instead." A ghost of a smile touched Gabriel's lips. "That's my Elena, always standing your ground." His pride in her was genuine, but something darker lurked beneath it. Elena had seen that look before in the early days of their relationship when Gabriel was still transitioning from his old life. "Gabriel, I know what you're thinking. And what am I thinking more? That you need to do something about it. That the Harringtons need to pay for what happened." Gabriel didn't deny it. Instead, he refilled their wine glasses, movements deliberate and controlled. "You were humiliated publicly. Kingston, who works for my company, sided with the perpetrator, and now a video of my wife being assaulted is circulating online. Should I do nothing?" Elena gripped his hand tighter. "What happened was horrible, yes. But this is exactly the kind of situation that used to pull you back into that world. You promised me, Gabriel. You promised you were done with that life." His eyes softened as he looked at her, genuine conflict visible in their depths. "I keep my promises to you, Elena. Always. But this isn't about revenge. It's about justice. About consequences for actions." Elena knew this Gabriel, the one who could rationalize anything, when he felt those he loved had been threatened. The man whose moral compass had been shaped in neighborhoods where justice rarely came from authorities. "Promise me you won't go back to your old ways. No violence, no threats. Promise me." Gabriel raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I promise. No violence. No threats. Just business." Elena wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. But she knew Gabriel Vega better than anyone knew the steel beneath a successful businessman's veneer. Whatever he was planning would be calculated, careful, and completely devastating. The morning brought fresh snow and new complications. Elena woke to find Gabriel already dressed and on the phone in his home office, speaking too quietly for her to hear. Her own phone had exploded with notifications, messages from friends and former colleagues, all sending the same video. It had gone viral overnight, picked up by major news outlets and social media influencers, framed as yet another example of the entitled rich abusing service workers. Elena felt sick seeing her humiliation replayed for millions. Worse still was the statement released by Harrington Development Group, appearing in her newsfeed. Regarding the incident at the Renaissance restaurant last evening, Harrington Development Group regrets any misunderstanding that may have occurred. Our investigation suggests the employee in question demonstrated unprofessional behavior prior to the recorded interaction. We trust the management of the Renaissance will address this personnel matter appropriately. The Harrington family remains committed to supporting New York's hospitality industry. They were blaming her, painting her as unprofessional, suggesting she had provoked Brandon's behavior. The injustice of it made her hands shake. Gabriel appeared in the doorway of their bedroom, his expression grim as he watched her reading the statement. "They're calling me unprofessional, making it sound like I deserved what happened." Gabriel's voice was unnaturally calm, sending a chill through Elena. "They're scared, trying to control the narrative before it damages them further." "What do you mean further?" Gabriel sat beside her on the bed, taking her phone gently and setting it aside. "Brandon Harrington has a history, Elena. This isn't the first time he's harassed service staff. Just the first time it's been caught on video." "How do you know this?" "I have resources, people who owe me favors." The vagueness of his answer worried her. Gabriel continued, his voice softening. "You have options, Elena. You could let this go, try to move past it. Or you could fight back. Tell your side of the story, expose them for what they are. Or you could let me handle it. Three simple options, each with its own consequences." Elena studied her husband's face, seeing the restraint it took for him to even offer the first option. Gabriel Vega had never been one to turn the other cheek. "I need to think, of course. Take all the time you need. I have meetings this morning, but I'll be home for dinner." He kissed her forehead before leaving the gesture tender, despite the calculation she had glimpsed in his eyes. Elena knew that regardless of what she decided, Gabriel was already setting things in motion. The question was whether she would be part of it or simply a witness. She spent the morning researching Brandon Harrington, diving deep into social media and news archives. What she found had confirmed Gabriel's claim: multiple incidents of inappropriate behavior, quietly settled photos of drunken escapades on yachts and at exclusive clubs, evidence of a life lived without consequences. Several of Brandon's former classmates had posted comments on the viral video, sharing their own stories of his entitlement and cruelty. Elena's phone rang, an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. "Elena Vega." "Yes, who's calling?" "Amelia Chen." "I'm a civil rights attorney. I specialize in workplace harassment cases. Do you have a moment to talk about what happened at the Renaissance?" "How did you get my number?" "A mutual acquaintance, Miguel Garcia. He's my cousin's son. He thought you might need legal representation given how quickly this is escalating." Elena considered hanging up. Getting involved with lawyers meant prolonging the incident, keeping it alive in public consciousness. But the Harrington statement, blaming her for her own humiliation, still burned. "I'm listening." Across Manhattan, in the sleek conference room of Taste of Legacy's headquarters, Gabriel Vega sat at the head of a long table. Around him were 12 men and women, his most trusted lieutenants, each responsible for different aspects of his business empire. The mood was somber as they watched the video of Elena's humiliation play on the large screen. Gabriel waited until the video ended before speaking, his voice controlled, almost gentle. "This is personal for me. I won't pretend it isn't, but it's also business. The Renaissance is our flagship. What happened there last night and Kingston's response to it reflects on all of us." Vanessa Chang, his chief operations officer, spoke first. "Kingston should be fired immediately. His handling of the situation was inexcusable." "Agreed. As of this morning, he no longer works for Taste of Legacy. But this goes beyond one manager's poor judgment. The Harringtons have made this about Elena's professionalism, her character. They've made it public." Mike Russo, sitting to Gabriel's right, pulled up the Harrington statement on the screen. "They're running a standard PR playbook. Deflect, minimize, blame the victim. Brandon Harrington has a documented history of similar incidents. He projected a series of social media posts, police reports that never led to charges, hush settlements with former employees." "What exactly are you proposing, Gabriel?" The question came from David Mercer, the group's CFO, always the most cautious of Gabriel's inner circle. Gabriel leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. "I'm not proposing violence. I know what some of you are thinking, that the old Gabriel would have handled this differently." A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged around the table. Most knew fragments of Gabriel's past, though few knew the full extent. "What I'm proposing is consequences. professional financial consequences for behavior that should not be tolerated in our establishments or anywhere else. And how do we deliver these consequences? Gabriel's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a cold certainty. The Harrington Development Group has 4 major projects currently under construction in New York Sunset Heights, in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Central Manhattan View, near Hudson Yards and Queens Waterfront. Combined value approximately $1.6 billion. He projected a complex web of companies, suppliers, and contractors onto the screen. These projects rely on a supply chain that directly or indirectly we have significant influence over. Concrete suppliers, steel distributors, union relationships, permit expeditors. Mike Russo took over, highlighting specific connections. Through various shell companies and strategic investments, Taste of Legacy has minority interests in 3 of the major suppliers for these projects. Additionally, Gabriel personally maintains relationships with 4 union leaders whose workers are essential to these developments. Several faces around the table registered surprise. Gabriel's restaurant empire was successful, but few had realized how far his influence extended into other industries. Vanessa leaned forward, studying the diagram. You've been positioning us as more than restaurants for years. Why didn't you tell the full board diversification protects us from downturns in the restaurant industry? I kept these investments compartmentalized for legal and practical reasons. Gabriel stood, moving to the window overlooking Manhattan. I'm not suggesting we do anything illegal, just a series of unfortunate coincidences. Delivery delays, labor disputes, permit reviews that take slightly longer than expected. Nothing that can be traced back to us, nothing that breaks any laws, just the normal complications of doing business in New York, and all happening at once. David Mercer frowned, always the voice of caution. You're talking about economic warfare against a $2 billion company because the owner's son behaved badly at a party. The potential blowback is minimal compared to what Elena experienced, and what the next person might experience if Brandon Harrington continues to operate without consequences. Gabriel turned back to the group, his expression resolute. I'm not asking for unanimous support. I understand the risks. Anyone uncomfortable with this direction is free to recuse themselves. No questions asked, no repercussions. The room fell silent. Finally, Mike Russo spoke. I'm in. The Harringtons think they can buy their way out of anything. Time they learned otherwise. One by one, the others nodded their agreement. Only David Mercer hesitated. I want it on record that I advise caution. But I trust your judgment, Gabriel. I always have. Gabriel acknowledged this with a nod. Then we begin today. Mike will coordinate the operations. Nothing flashy, nothing traceable. Just a series of small complications that, taken together, create significant pressure. The Harringtons won't know what's happening until it's too late to stop it. As the meeting adjourned, Gabriel remained at the window, watching the city below. New York had taught him long ago that power wasn't about violence or threats. It was about systems, relationships, and patience. The Harringtons were about to learn the same lesson. Elena's meeting with Amelia Chen took place in a small coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from Manhattan's financial district, where they might be recognized. The attorney was younger than Elena had expected, perhaps early 30s, with a sharp intelligence in her eyes. The video gives us leverage, but the Harrington statement complicates things. They're trying to discredit you before you can take action. Amelia spread several documents across the table. What exactly would taking action look like? A civil suit for assault, harassment, defamation. Possibly a class action if we can find others who've experienced similar treatment. Elena stirred her coffee, watching the small whirlpool form in the dark liquid. I'm not interested in money. Most people say that at first. But compensation isn't just about enriching you. It's about creating consequences meaningful enough to change behavior. Elena thought about Gabriel's words that morning, about consequences, about justice. What would we need to make this case strong? Amelia smiled, pulling out a notebook. Testimonies from other victims, evidence of a pattern, witnesses from the gala who can corroborate your account. But most importantly, we need you ready to withstand public scrutiny. They'll dig into your past, try to discredit you. Are you prepared for that? Elena thought about her life, her childhood in Mexico, her training as a nurse before immigrating, her years working in restaurants, while studying English, meeting Gabriel, their life together. She had nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. I can handle scrutiny. My concern is for my husband. Amelia's expression shifted subtly. Gabriel Vega, CEO of Taste of Legacy. You've done your homework. It's my job to be thorough. His involvement could be complicated. The Renaissance is owned by his company, which creates potential conflicts of interest. Elena hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Gabriel supports whatever decision I make, but I want to handle this my way. Amelia studied her for a moment before nodding. I understand. Let's start by gathering testimonies from others who've experienced similar treatment from Brandon Harrington. The video has already inspired several people to come forward on social media. As they strategized, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Gabriel. Thinking of you. Whatever you decide, I'm with you, always. Elena put her phone away, focusing on Amelia's plan. She had chosen her path, not Gabriel's way of shadow games and economic pressure, but a public stand for dignity and respect. What she didn't know was that both approaches were already in motion, creating a pincer movement the Harringtons would never see coming. The first domino fell 3 days later at Harrington's Sunset Heights development in the Bronx. At 6:30 a.m., as workers arrived for the day's critical concrete pour for the building's foundation, the site manager received an urgent call. We've got a problem. Northeast Concrete Supply just called. All their trucks are down, mechanical issues. They can't make the delivery. The site manager, a veteran of New York construction, felt his stomach drop. That's impossible. We have a foundation pour scheduled for 7 hours. We've got 60 workers standing by. I know. They're saying earliest they can deliver is next week. Next week, the permit expires Friday. If we miss this pour, we're looking at weeks of delays, maybe months. The site manager made frantic calls to alternative suppliers. Each gave the same response: fully booked, no availability, equipment issues. By 9:00 a.m., he had to call Charles Harrington directly. Across town at the Brooklyn Central project, a similar scene unfolded. The steelworkers' union representative arrived with concerns about safety protocols, demanding an immediate inspection before work could continue. The Queens waterfront project received notice of an environmental review that would delay groundbreaking by at least 30 days. At Manhattan View, critical permits were suddenly under review by the city's notoriously slow bureaucracy. By noon, Charles Harrington had convened an emergency meeting in his sleek offices overlooking Central Park. His project managers delivered the bad news one after another, painting a picture of simultaneous crises across all 4 major developments. This can't be coincidence. Charles's voice was tight with controlled fury. His COO, Patricia Vance, nodded grimly. The timing is suspicious, especially coming right after. She trailed off, but everyone knew what she meant. The video of Brandon's behavior had gone viral with over 10 million views across platforms. Memes had emerged, late-night comedians had incorporated it into monologues, and "Justice for the Waitress" was trending on Twitter. My son's behavior is unfortunate, but irrelevant to our business operations. I want solutions, not speculation. Charles dismissed the connection, but doubt had crept in. 30 years in New York, real estate had taught him that coincidences were rare in this business. Someone was sending a message. What's the financial impact if these delays continue? Martin Ross, the CFO, pulled up a spreadsheet. If we miss the Sunset Heights Foundation deadline, we trigger penalty clauses with Chase Bank, approximately $2 million in additional interest. Brooklyn Central is already 3 weeks behind schedule. Further delays could jeopardize our tax abatement. Queens and Manhattan are early enough in development that delays are less costly but still problematic for investor confidence. Charles stared out the window at the city he had spent decades reshaping through sheer force of will and financial acumen. Find alternative suppliers. Pay whatever it takes. I want those projects moving again by the end of the week. As the meeting adjourned, Charles remained at the window mine, working through possibilities. Who had the reach to disrupt multiple projects simultaneously? Who had connections with suppliers, unions, and city officials? And most importantly, who had motive to target Harrington development? Specifically, his phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Sailing in Montauk this weekend. Don't wait up. Attached was a photo of his son on a yacht, champagne bottle in hand, surrounded by models in bikinis. Charles felt a surge of frustration. While their company faced crisis, Brandon continued his carefree lifestyle, oblivious to the consequences of his actions. Perhaps for the first time, Charles considered whether his decades of protecting Brandon from repercussions had created not just an entitled son, but a genuine liability to the empire he had built. In the Vega penthouse, Elena prepared for her first public interview about the incident. A sympathetic reporter from the New York Times was due to arrive in an hour. Amelia had coached her on what to say and what to avoid, emphasizing the systemic nature of the problem rather than just her personal experience. Gabriel watched from the doorway as she applied her makeup with careful precision. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure. Hiding won't solve anything. The Harringtons made this public when they blamed me in their statement. Now they can face the consequences of that choice." Gabriel moved behind her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "I'm proud of you. Not everyone has the courage to stand up publicly." Elena covered his hand with hers. "I learned from you. You built something from nothing, face down, people who said you didn't belong in their world." She turned to face him. "Speaking of building things, there are rumors about problems at Harrington's construction sites. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Gabriel's expression remained neutral, but Elena knew him too well to be fooled. "Just the normal complications of doing business in New York. Construction is unpredictable, permits, supplies, labor. Things go wrong all the time. Gabriel, I promised you, Elena. No violence, no threats, just business. I've kept that promise." His phone buzzed with a notification. Gabriel glanced at it, a slight smile touching his lips before he masked it. "I have to take this. Good luck with your interview. Remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You stood your ground against someone who thought his wealth made him untouchable." After Gabriel left, Elena checked her own phone, finding messages of support from former colleagues and friends. The most recent was from Miguel, who had lost his job at the Renaissance for recording the video, but had been immediately hired as a sous chef at one of Gabriel's other restaurants. "Thank you for standing up. You're inspiring others to do the same." The doorbell rang, the Times reporter arriving for the interview that would transform Elena from anonymous victim to public advocate. As she moved to answer it, Elena felt a strange mix of trepidation and resolve. This path was her choice, not Gabriel's shadow war, but a public stand for dignity. Yet somewhere deep inside, she couldn't help but feel satisfaction knowing that while she fought in the light, Gabriel was fighting in the darkness. The Harringtons had managed to make enemies of both Vega approaches, and they didn't even know it yet. As snow continued to fall outside, Elena opened the door to face the next chapter of a battle that had begun with a single spilled drink, but would end with far greater consequences than anyone could have predicted. The New York Times article hit like a bomb on a Tuesday morning, splashing across the front page of the Metro section, "Elite Behavior Harassment in New York's High-End Restaurants." Elena's interview had transformed from personal account to devastating exposé. 5 former service workers had come forward with similar stories about Brandon Harrington, a bartender he'd groped at the Standard, a hotel concierge he'd verbally abused at the Four Seasons, a valet he'd threatened to have fired when his car wasn't retrieved quickly enough. Charles Harrington slammed the paper down on his desk, jaw tight with barely contained fury. The article hadn't just recounted Elena's humiliation. It had meticulously documented Brandon's pattern of entitlement and abuse, complete with dates, locations, and corroborating witnesses. Worse still, it had drawn connections to the company's business practices, questioning whether Harrington Development Group's corporate culture enabled or even rewarded such behavior. The damage was already spreading. Social media had erupted overnight. 3 corporate partners had called to postpone upcoming joint ventures. The company's stock had dropped 4% in pre-market trading. Charles's assistant had compiled a list of reporters seeking comment, including CNBC and Bloomberg. This had transcended social scandal and become business news. Brandon stumbled into the office just after 11, sunglasses hiding his hangover, completely oblivious to the storm he'd unleashed. His casual stroll through the executive floor drew glares from staff who'd spent the morning in crisis management. "What's with all the long faces? Someone died." Charles gestured sharply for Brandon to enter his office, closing the door behind them. He thrust the newspaper into his son's hands. "Have you seen this?" Brandon skimmed the headline, shrugging dismissively. "So what's some waitress trying to get her 15 minutes of fame? It'll blow over by the weekend." Charles felt a flash of disbelief. How had he raised someone so utterly detached from consequences? "This isn't going away. This article is just the beginning. They're talking class action lawsuit. Our stock is down. Partners are getting nervous." Brandon tossed the paper onto the desk, finally removing his sunglasses to reveal bloodshot eyes. "Jesus, Dad, it was one drink. Not like I stabbed her or something. You humiliated a woman on camera. A woman who happens to be married to Gabriel Vega." A flicker of uncertainty finally crossed Brandon's face. Who? Taste of Legacy. 18 restaurants across the city, including the Renaissance. One of the most powerful men in the hospitality industry, and you poured a drink on his wife. For the first time, Brandon seemed to grasp the severity of the situation. Not because of Elena's humiliation, but because he'd unwittingly offended someone with power comparable to his father's. How was I supposed to know who she was married to? She's just a server. The casual dismissal made Charles wince. He moved to the window looking out at the Manhattan skyline, a vista that had always represented his conquest of the city, his rise from upper-middle-class Connecticut to billionaire developer. Now it felt like a landscape of potential enemies, any one of whom might be connected to Gabriel Vega. That's the point, Brandon. Everyone is someone. Everyone matters to somebody. That's a lesson you should have learned 20 years ago. Charles dismissed his son, who retreated to nurse his hangover and a reputation at his penthouse apartment. The real estate mogul spent the remainder of the day in emergency meetings with his PR team and executive officers. His initial instinct was to fight fire with fire, deploy their considerable media connections to counter the narrative, perhaps dig into Gabriel Vega's background for leverage. But caution prevailed. If Vega indeed had the connections, his reputation suggested poking that bear could prove catastrophic. The Harrington approach settled on damage control, a carefully worded statement expressing concern about the incident while suggesting a comprehensive review of corporate policies. Not an admission of guilt, but enough to appear responsive without taking responsibility. The statement emphasized Brandon's temporary leave of absence and the company's long-standing commitment to respect in all business dealings. What Charles didn't know was that Gabriel Vega had anticipated this exact response. For 2 decades, Gabriel had cultivated a network that extended far beyond restaurants. Like a chess player thinking 5 moves ahead, he had positioned pieces across multiple industries, not for this specific conflict, but to ensure he would never be vulnerable again. Across town, Elena was finding her own path to reclaiming power. After her New York Times interview had catalyzed others to speak out, she'd been approached by a nonprofit that provided job training for women escaping domestic violence. They'd asked if she would teach a workshop on workplace rights and dignity, something that had evolved into a weekly class. Today, 12 women sat around a large kitchen island as Elena demonstrated knife skills, a practical cooking lesson that doubled as a forum for discussing workplace boundaries. Most restaurant jobs require these basic techniques, but they also require you to understand your rights. No one customer manager owner has the right to make you feel unsafe or disrespected. Elena moved among them, adjusting grips, demonstrating the proper angle for chopping vegetables. These women had survived far worse than a drink being poured on them: domestic abuse, homelessness, addiction. Yet their eagerness to learn to rebuild their lives filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since leaving her nursing career in Mexico. Maria, a young mother of 2 who had escaped an abusive husband 6 months earlier, looked up from her careful dicing. "What you did standing up to that rich guy, it gave me courage. If you can stand up to someone like that, maybe I can stand up to my ex when he comes back." Elena squeezed her shoulder gently, unexpected emotion tightening her throat. Her personal humiliation had somehow transformed into something empowering for others. The lawsuit was proceeding. Amelia had filed the paperwork for a class action the previous week, but this tangible impact meant more than any potential settlement. After class, Elena checked her phone to find a message from Gabriel. "Dinner at Emilio's tonight. I've missed you this week." Their schedules had barely overlapped lately, Gabriel consumed with business matters. He discussed only in generalities, Elena dividing her time between legal meetings and her new teaching role. She texted back her agreement, wondering how much Gabriel would share about his parallel campaign against the Harringtons. They'd reached an unspoken arrangement. She didn't ask specific questions about his methods, and he supported her public advocacy without interference. But the distance between them felt unnatural after years of complete transparency. 2 weeks passed with little visible impact on the Harrington Development Group beyond the initial stock drop and media flurry. Charles Harrington began to breathe easier, believing the crisis was fading. Brandon remained on his leave of absence, instructed to keep a low profile until the story disappeared from the news cycle. The class action lawsuit seemed distant and manageable, a problem for lawyers to handle through standard delay tactics and eventual settlement negotiations. This false sense of security was precisely what Gabriel had planned for. His approach wasn't the brute force assault Charles might have expected from someone with rumored mafia connections. Instead, it was meticulous, patient, and impossible to trace directly back to him. The first warning sign came when Northeast Concrete Supply, the primary contractor for Harrington's Sunset Heights development in the Bronx, informed the project manager they would need to delay the scheduled foundation pour. Not because of mechanical failures or labor shortages, but due to supply chain issues affecting cement availability. They suggested a 3-week postponement. 3 weeks meant missing the contractual milestone, with Chase Bank triggering a penalty clause worth $2 million. The project manager called every alternative supplier in the tri-state area. Each had the same response: fully booked materials, limited earliest delivery in 4-6 weeks. 2 days later, the Queens Waterfront project received notice from the city's Department of Environmental Protection about a previously unidentified wetland habitat requiring additional assessment. The Brooklyn Central development faced sudden union concerns about structural safety protocols requiring immediate inspection and potential redesign. The Manhattan View project's crucial permits came under administrative review by the Department of Buildings. Each problem in isolation could be dismissed as the routine headaches of New York real estate development. Together, they painted a different picture. Charles recognized the pattern before his executive team did. Someone was systematically targeting every major Harrington project, simultaneously exploiting vulnerabilities that should have been known only to insiders. On day 17 of what Charles had begun calling the siege, he convened a crisis meeting in Harrington Group's secure conference room. The atmosphere was grim. 4 major projects representing $1.6 billion in a development stood paralyzed. The quarterly report loomed 3 weeks away with no progress to show investors. The stock had dropped another 6% as industry analysts noted the unusual delays across multiple sites. Patricia Vance, his COO for 15 years, finally voiced what many had been thinking. We need to consider the possibility that this is deliberate, that someone is coordinating these disruptions. Charles had been avoiding this conclusion despite the mounting evidence. Acknowledgement meant admitting vulnerability, something he'd spent a lifetime training himself against. If you're right, who has the reach to orchestrate something this comprehensive? Patricia pulled up a diagram on her tablet, a complex web of companies, suppliers, unions, and city officials connected to their 4 major projects. It would take someone with extensive connections across multiple industries. Someone with influence in construction, labor relations, banking, and city government. And motive. Don't forget motive. This came from Martin Ross, the CFO, who had been unusually quiet during recent meetings. The timing suggests a connection to the Renaissance incident. Gabriel Vega has interests beyond restaurants, real estate holdings, investment companies. We've never done a deep dive because he wasn't a competitor. Charles leaned back in his chair, connecting dots he should have seen earlier. Do it now. I want to know every business Vega touches, every board he sits on, every politician who owes him favors. Patricia nodded, already typing instructions to the research team. And if it is Vega, what do you propose? That we call him up and apologize. The sarcasm in Charles's voice didn't mask his growing concern. If Vega was indeed orchestrating this campaign, it demonstrated a level of influence and ruthlessness Charles hadn't anticipated. The restaurant magnate was suddenly looking less like a self-made success story and more like something darker. Martin cleared his throat uncomfortably. Maybe that's exactly what we need to do. Not just apologize, make amends. The longer this goes on, the more it costs us. We're looking at potential losses in the tens of millions if these projects stay delayed. Charles stared at his CFO, genuine shock crossing his features. In 30 years of business, he had never once backed down from a fight. You're suggesting we capitulate, show weakness. I'm suggesting we cut our losses. Business is business, Charles. Pride is expensive. For the first time in his career, Charles Harrington felt truly outmaneuvered. Whatever game Vega was playing, he had changed the rules without warning anyone. If Charles was honest with himself, something he rarely bothered with, he had underestimated the restaurant owner, dismissed him as new money, a former cook who got lucky. Now he was beginning to wonder if there was more to Gabriel Vega than his public persona suggested. The investigation into Gabriel Vega's business interests took another week to compile, longer than expected, because the ownership structures required tracing through multiple shell companies, trusts, and international entities. When the report finally landed on Charles's desk, the comprehensive nature of Gabriel's influence shocked even him. The concrete supplier experiencing supply chain issues was majority owned by an investment firm where one of the silent partners was 3 degrees removed from Taste of Legacy's parent company. The union rep who'd raised safety concerns at Brooklyn Central received substantial funding from a charitable foundation chaired by Gabriel's cousin. The city officials reviewing permits had all received campaign donations from business leaders with connections to Gabriel's restaurant empire. Most concerning of all was the banking revelation. Gabriel Vega had spent the past 5 years cultivating relationships with key figures at both Chase and Goldman Sachs, the two primary lenders for Harrington's development projects. Not through bribes or threats, but through legitimate business, hosting private dining events, catering executive retreats, sponsoring charitable functions where banking executives served as honorary chairs. Charles stared at the organizational chart mapping these connections, ice forming in his stomach. This was no random business dispute. This was systematic economic strangulation planned with the patience and precision of a master strategist. More disturbing still, some of these relationships predated the Renaissance incident by years. Gabriel hadn't built this network in response to Elena's humiliation. He'd had it in place already like a dormant weapon, waiting for justification to deploy. By the 1-month mark, the financial consequences had become impossible to ignore. Harrington Development Group's stock had fallen 17%. Construction loans were accruing interest with no progress to show. Investors were demanding explanations Charles couldn't provide without admitting he was under attack. The next blow came from an unexpected direction. Chase Bank called an emergency review of Harrington's construction loans for the Sunset Heights and Manhattan View projects. Goldman Sachs followed within hours, expressing serious concerns about project timelines for Queens Waterfront and Brooklyn Central. Both institutions cited market uncertainty and execution risk rather than specific complaints. But the message was clear: the financial lifelines supporting Harrington's empire were under scrutiny. Charles authorized extraordinary measures, offering premium rates to alternative suppliers, hiring specialized consultants to address the permit issues, even reaching out to political connections he typically saved for critical situations. Nothing worked. Each potential solution hit the same invisible wall: polite refusals, unexpected complications, or simply silence. The banking situation deteriorated further in week 6. Chase's risk management team recommended reclassifying the Harrington loans as elevated risk, increasing reserve requirements, and triggering a 1-point interest rate increase. The additional cost, $4.7 million annually across the two projects. Goldman Sachs hadn't yet taken similar action, but had scheduled a formal review. More ominously, rumors reached Charles that certain investment groups were expressing interest in purchasing Harrington's debt from the banks at a discount, of course, given the apparent risk. The potential buyers remained anonymous, but Charles suspected Gabriel's hand behind the offers. Martin Ross confirmed his fears during their daily crisis meeting. "We've received information that 3 separate investment entities have approached Chase about acquiring our Sunset Heights construction loan. They're offering 87 cents on the dollar." Charles felt his blood pressure spike. "And Chase is considering it. Their risk committee meets tomorrow. Given the project delays and our stock decline, selling the debt would allow them to reduce their exposure without technically violating our lending agreement. If they sell, whoever buys the debt could potentially call the loan if we miss additional milestones. We could be forced to repay $120 million immediately." Martin nodded grimly. "Which we can't do without liquidating other assets at fire sale prices." Charles stood pacing the conference room like a caged predator. "This is financial warfare. We need to fight back, find our own leverage." Patricia Vance had been unusually quiet during the meeting, reviewing documents on her tablet. She looked up with uncharacteristic hesitation. "There may be another option. I've been researching Gabriel Vega's background beyond the business connections. There are rumors." "What kind of rumors?" "His early life, before he became a restaurant owner. Connections to certain Italian families in the Bronx. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, but enough smoke to suggest fire." Charles considered this new information. The implied suggestion was clear. Fight dirty expose: Gabriel's rumored mafia connections damaged the carefully constructed, legitimate business persona he'd built. The temptation was powerful, a familiar approach that had served Charles well against other opponents. But something stopped him. Not moral qualms. Charles had few of those when his empire was threatened. Rather, a sudden clarity about the man he was facing. If the mafia rumors were true, Gabriel Vega had successfully buried that past for decades, while building an apparently legitimate business empire. That suggested both patience and thoroughness. neither quality indicating someone who would leave himself vulnerable to such an obvious counterattack. Let me think about it. For now, focus on the banks. Offer additional collateral personal guarantees, whatever it takes to prevent them from selling those loans. The meeting adjourned with an air of desperation that had never before pervaded Harrington Development Group's executive floor. Charles remained alone in the conference room, staring at the organizational chart detailing Gabriel Vega's influence network. The realization struck him with uncomfortable force. He wasn't just fighting a vengeful husband. He was facing a man who might have spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this type of conflict, the systematic dismantling of an opponent without a single threatening word or violent act. That evening, Emilio's restaurant in the West Village welcomed back its most important patrons. Gabriel had reserved the private back room, the same one where he and Elena had first met 8 years earlier. The small Italian restaurant remained unchanged despite Gabriel's empire expanding around it. The original handwritten menus, the same vintage Chianti bottles decorating the walls, the garden view now dusted with early autumn leaves rather than snow. Elena arrived slightly late, her cheeks flushed from the cool evening air. Gabriel stood as she entered, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure despite the weeks of strategic warfare consuming his attention. For a moment, they were just Gabriel and Elena again, not the power couple navigating a high-profile scandal, not adversaries of the Harringtons, just two people who had found each other against all odds. "You look beautiful tonight." Gabriel kissed her cheek, pulling out her chair with old-world courtesy. Elena felt some of her tension dissolve. Whatever complicated game they were playing with the Harringtons, this connection remained real. "I've been watching you on the news. You're changing the conversation, Elena. Making people think about how they treat service workers." Elena accepted a glass of wine, studying her husband's face. Despite his obvious pride and her shadows of exhaustion lingered under his eyes. "And how is your approach going?" "The one we don't talk about." Gabriel's smile turned enigmatic. "Let's just say the Harringtons are having a difficult month. Their projects are stalled. Their investors are nervous. Their stock is down almost 20%. You did all that without breaking your promise. No threats, no violence, just business amour. Their supply chain is experiencing complications. Their permits require additional review. Their labor relations have become strained. Nothing illegal, nothing that can be traced back to us." Elena took a sip of wine, considering the implications. Gabriel had weaponized capitalism itself against the Harringtons, using the same systems that had allowed their rise to engineer their fall. "And if Charles Harrington figures out you're behind it," Gabriel shrugged, unconcerned. "He already suspects. His people have been investigating Taste of Legacy's corporate structure, our investments, our connections. They're smart, but the layers of separation are too complex to prove anything conclusively." Elena leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the private room. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish, Gabriel? How does this end?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Gabriel's confident expression. "That depends partly on you, on what you want from your lawsuit. Justice looks different to different people. I want accountability. I want Brandon to face consequences for once in his privileged life. I want systems to change so what happened to me can't happen to someone else." Gabriel nodded slowly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Then that's what we'll achieve, together, your way and mine." The meal progressed with lighter conversation. Elena sharing stories from her cooking class, Gabriel describing a new restaurant concept he was considering. For a few precious hours, they existed in a bubble of normalcy, the weight of their separate battles temporarily lifted. As they waited for dessert, Gabriel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, a satisfied expression crossing his features before he silenced it and returned it to his pocket. "Good news. The First Bank has sold Harrington's construction loans. They got nervous about the delays, wanted to reduce their exposure." Elena frowned slightly. "Why is that good news?" "Because one of my investment groups bought the debt. At a discount. We now control 30% of Harrington Development's financing for the Sunset Heights project." Elena set down her wine glass, suddenly understanding the full scope of Gabriel's strategy. He wasn't just creating problems for the Harringtons, he was positioning himself to control their fate. "You're not trying to destroy them, you're trying to own them." Gabriel's eyes met hers, a hardness there that reminded her of the man he'd been before they met. "I'm creating options, Elena. Leverage. When the time comes for resolution, they'll have no choice but to accept our terms." The bubble of normalcy popped, reality rushing back in. Elena saw again the complexity of the man she'd married, part legitimate businessman, part shadow operator, capable of patience and calculation that bordered on frightening. And what are our terms, Gabriel? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's what we need to decide, together. 3 days later, Elena received a call from Amelia Chen. While still in bed, Gabriel already gone for an early meeting. Have you seen the Harrington counterstatement? It just hit the news sites. Elena grabbed her tablet, pulling up the New York Times website. There it was, a formal response from Harrington Development Group to the growing scandal. Harrington Development Group acknowledges the seriousness of the allegations regarding Brandon Harrington's behavior at the Renaissance restaurant and other establishments. While we maintain that initial reports contained mischaracterizations, we recognize the need for a fuller investigation. Brandon Harrington has taken a leave of absence from his position as Vice President of Client Relations to reflect on recent events. The company reaffirms its commitment to respectful business practices at all levels. Amelia's voice crackled with excitement. They're retreating. The pressure's working. It's not an apology. No, but it's an acknowledgement. That's the first step. They've removed Brandon from his position temporarily, at least. That gives us leverage for settlement talks. Elena stared at the statement, reading between the lines. This wasn't capitulation, it was tactical repositioning. Charles Harrington was trying to contain the damage, preserve the company's reputation while sacrificing as little as possible. Brandon's leave of absence was a token gesture, not genuine accountability. They're just buying time, waiting for the story to die down. Amelia sighed, always the pragmatist. Probably. But it's still movement in the right direction. And the class action is proceeding. We've now got 7 plaintiffs with documented incidents. This isn't going away just because Brandon is temporarily out of the public eye. Elena ended the call feeling unsatisfied. The Harrington statement represented the kind of halfway measures she had come to expect from powerful institutions, acknowledged just enough to appear responsive while changing nothing fundamental. Brandon would retreat to the Hamptons or Miami for a few weeks, then quietly return once public attention shifted elsewhere. Gabriel called around noon. You've seen their statement. I have. It's meaningless. Brandon gets a vacation while they wait for this to blow over. Gabriel's voice carried a hint of satisfaction that puzzled her. Actually, it's quite revealing. Charles is trying to distance the company from Brandon's behavior, protecting the brand while sacrificing the son. It suggests division in their ranks. What do you mean? Think about it, Elena. For decades, Charles has protected Brandon from every consequence. Now suddenly he's willing to publicly acknowledge his son's misconduct. Something's changed. Elena considered this perspective. Gabriel had always been skilled at reading people's motivations, seeing the calculations behind their actions. You think Charles is genuinely angry with Brandon? Not just managing public relations. I think Charles is finally recognizing that Brandon is a liability. That's useful information. Useful how? We'll discuss it tonight. I need to go meeting with the banks about those loans we acquired. Gabriel's cryptic response left Elena unsettled. She had agreed to their parallel approaches, her public advocacy, his behind-the-scenes pressure. But sometimes it felt like Gabriel was playing a game several moves ahead of everyone, including her. Rather than dwelling on it, Elena channeled her energy into preparation for tomorrow's television appearance, a morning show interview where she would discuss workplace harassment alongside Amelia and 2 other plaintiffs in the class action. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, but Elena had quickly found her voice as an advocate. Years of managing difficult restaurant situations had honed her ability to remain composed under pressure. That evening, she discovered just how far Gabriel's campaign had progressed. He arrived home late, triumph evident in his expression, even before he spoke. Goldman Sachs sold their portion of the Harrington construction loans today at 85 cents on the dollar. And let me guess, one of your investment groups bought them. Gabriel removed his tie, pouring himself a scotch before joining her on the sofa. We now control 60% of their project financing across 3 developments. If they miss one more construction milestone, we can call the loans. Elena tried to process the implications. You could bankrupt them. Gabriel sipped his scotch, contemplating the amber liquid. Theoretically, but that's not the goal. What is the goal, Gabriel? Because sometimes I think you've forgotten this. Started with me, with what happened at the Renaissance. Gabriel set down his glass, turning to face her fully. The calculated businessman vanished, replaced by the man who had fallen in love with a waitress at his first restaurant. I haven't forgotten for 1 second. Every move I've made has been for you, Elena, to create a situation where they have no choice but to make things right. Elena looked away suddenly, overwhelmed by the scope of what Gabriel had engineered, a complex web of financial maneuvers designed to bring a billionaire to his knees, all because his son had humiliated her. This is so much bigger than pouring a drink on me. You've turned it into economic warfare. Gabriel's voice softened, one hand gently turning her face back toward him. Because they made it about more than that. They questioned your professionalism. They blamed you for your own humiliation. They tried to make you small, Elena. No one makes you small, not while I'm breathing. The fierce protectiveness in his eyes reminded Elena why she'd fallen in love with him. His absolute loyalty, his unwavering commitment to those he cared about. But it also frightened her, this capacity for calculated retribution that seemed to have no upper limit. What happens when Charles Harrington realizes the extent of what you've done? When he discovers you control most of his company's debt? Then he'll understand the position he's in, and he'll be ready to negotiate. Gabriel's confidence was absolute, brooking no possibility of failure or miscalculation. It was the same certainty that had driven him from poverty to empire, an unshakable belief in his own vision. Elena wondered not for the first time if that certainty might someday be his undoing. The following morning, as Elena prepared for her television appearance, Charles's private investigator delivered the final piece of the puzzle, confirmation that the three independent investment groups that had purchased Harrington's construction loans were all through various complex structures connected to Gabriel Vega's financial interests. Charles stared at the conclusive evidence, a strange calm replacing the anger and anxiety that had defined the past 6 weeks. The clarity of his position was almost liberating. He wasn't facing business setbacks or market forces or bad luck. He was facing one man who had systematically, patiently engineered his financial strangulation, a man who now controlled enough of Harrington Development's debt to force bankruptcy if he chose. The realization came with an unexpected side effect: respect. Twisted, reluctant respect, but respect nonetheless. Gabriel Vega hadn't used threats or violence or public confrontation. He had simply outmaneuvered Charles at his own game, using the very financial and economic tools that had built the Harrington empire to now hold it hostage. Charles sent a direct message to Gabriel's private email, an address obtained through considerable effort and expense. Just 3 lines. I understand the situation clearly now. We should talk. Name your time and place. The response came within an hour: tomorrow, 10 a.m., Metropolitan Club. The Metropolitan Club, one of New York's oldest and most exclusive membership organizations, represented neutral territory, a place where both men held membership but rarely visited. Charles recognized the symbolism. Not Gabriel's home turf, not Harrington territory, but the realm of old money and established power, the world that had long looked down on both the real estate developer and the restaurateur as nouveau riche outsiders. That afternoon, Charles summoned Brandon to the family's Upper East Side townhouse. His son arrived visibly annoyed at having his leave of absence interrupted, still treating the entire situation as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. What's so urgent? Couldn't wait until tomorrow. I'm supposed to be on leave. Remember? Your idea. Charles had prepared a careful speech, a reasoned explanation of the situation's gravity. But faced with his son's continued indifference, something inside him finally snapped. You've destroyed this company, my company, everything I've spent 30 years building. Brandon rolled his eyes, collapsing into an armchair with theatrical exhaustion. Dramatic much. It's been, 6 weeks? The waitress thing is already old news. Another month and no one will remember. Charles stared at his son, truly seeing him perhaps for the first time not as the heir he had imagined, but as the spoiled, empty person he had created through decades of indulgence and protection. Gabriel Vega controls 60% of our construction loans. He's orchestrated the delays at all our project sites. He's responsible for our stock collapse, and he's demanding your permanent removal from Harrington Development as part of his terms. Brandon's expression finally registered something beyond boredom, genuine alarm, as the severity of the situation penetrated his self-absorption. He can't do that. You're my father. This is our company. Charles laughed bitterly, pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. He can, and he has. The board is convening tomorrow after my meeting with Vega. They're expecting answer solutions. Right now, the only viable solution is accepting his terms. The betrayal hit Brandon like a physical blow. He stood, color rising in his face. You choose the company over me, your own son. Charles took a long swallow of scotch, the burn in his throat, nothing compared to the pain of this moment. The company is my legacy. I thought you would be too. I was wrong. Brandon's face contorted with rage and hurt the abandoned child suddenly visible beneath the entitled adult. So that's it. You're throwing me to the wolves to save your precious buildings. Charles set down his glass with deliberate care, struggling to maintain composure. You threw yourself to the wolves, Brandon. The moment you decided that humiliating a woman for your amusement was acceptable behavior. I just failed to pull you back in time. The recognition of his own complicity in Brandon's development, the ways his protection had enabled increasingly destructive behavior, landed with crushing weight. Charles had built an empire of steel and concrete while neglecting the only human foundation that truly mattered. Brandon stormed out, slamming the door with childish force. Charles remained in his study, surrounded by photographs chronicling their life together, Brandon's graduation holidays in Europe, sailing off Martha's Vineyard. Moments that had seemed to confirm his success as both businessman and father, now revealed as illusions, masking his fundamental failure at the latter role. The next morning, Charles arrived at the Metropolitan Club 20 minutes early, not as a power move, but from genuine anxiety. The oak-paneled reading room he'd reserved offered privacy without isolation, old money's preference for dignified confrontation, rather than secretive dealings. Gabriel Vega arrived precisely on time, entering the room with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in any environment regardless of pedigree. Charles noted with irritation that Vega looked completely at ease, showing none of the deference that new money typically displayed toward old. Mr. Harrington, thank you for suggesting this meeting. I've been looking forward to it. Gabriel took a seat, not opposite Charles as expected, but at the other end of the small table, establishing equal footing from the outset. The power move wasn't lost on Charles, who had employed similar tactics throughout his career. Let's dispense with pleasantries, Vega. We both know why we're here. Gabriel smiled, slightly unfazed by the brusque tone. Dewey, perhaps you should clarify your understanding of the situation. Charles felt his temper rise at the deliberate obtuseness, but forced himself to remain calm. Losing control would only concede more advantage. My son behaved inappropriately toward your wife. The incident was unfortunate, regrettable, but your response has been disproportionate. Gabriel raised an eyebrow, expression one of polite interest rather than defensiveness. My response, I'm not sure I understand. Charles slid a folder across the table, the investigator's report detailing Gabriel's connections to Harrington's current difficulties. You've orchestrated a coordinated campaign against my company, disrupted our supply chain, interfered with our labor relations, complicated our regulatory approvals. You've acquired our debt through shell companies, positioning yourself to potentially force a default. Gabriel opened the folder, scanning its contents with mild curiosity rather than alarm. When he looked up, his expression remained impassive. That's quite a conspiracy theory, Mr. Harrington. Though I'm flattered you think I have such reach. We both know it's not a theory. You've been systematically strangling my operations for 6 weeks. The question is, what it will take for you to stop. Gabriel closed the folder, sliding it back across the table. What happened to Elena was more than inappropriate behavior. Your son deliberately humiliated my wife in public. Your company then blamed her, questioning her professionalism. When others came forward with similar experiences, you dismissed them too. Charles leaned forward, abandoning pretense. Name your price, Vega. Every man has one. Gabriel's expression hardened, the mask of civility slipping for just a moment. That's your mistake, Harrington. You think everything can be resolved with money, that everyone can be bought. Some things can't be purchased. Dignity, respect, accountability. So what do you want? An apology? Brandon's resignation, a public flogging. The sarcasm in Charles's voice betrayed his growing desperation. Gabriel seemed to sense it, his posture relaxing slightly as he recognized his advantage. What I want is what Elena wants. She's the injured party here, not me. And she wants real change, not just a performative apology or a charitable donation to make this go away. Charles scoffed, gesturing dismissively. Real change. Corporate speak for what? Sensitivity training, diversity initiatives, PR window dressing. Gabriel's expression turned cold, all pretense of polite negotiation vanishing. Let me be clear, Mr. Harrington. Your company is currently on life support, and I control the plug. Your projects are stalled, your investors are fleeing, your stock has lost nearly 20% of its value. I now control 60% of your construction financing. With one phone call, I can demand immediate repayment of those loans. Charles felt ice form in his stomach. The threat wasn't just bluster. Gabriel Vega genuinely held the power to destroy Harrington Development Group. Decades of empire building, all vulnerable because of Brandon's childish cruelty and his own failure to address it. What do you want? Gabriel leaned back, studying Charles with calculating eyes. A public apology from you and Brandon to Elena and all the other women who've come forward. Not a press release, a press conference. In person. Unscripted. Charles nodded stiffly, already calculating the PR damage against the catastrophic alternative. And Brandon's permanent removal from Harrington Development Group. Not a leave of absence resignation, with a binding agreement preventing his return. The demand struck at Charles's heart, the succession plan. He had built his life around the legacy he had always assumed would pass to his only child. But faced with potential ruin, sentimentality became an unaffordable luxury. Fine, what else? A $50 million endowment to establish a foundation supporting hospitality workers who experience harassment, with Elena as chairperson of the board. Charles nearly laughed at the audacity demanding Brandon's career, and tens of millions for a foundation controlled by Gabriel's wife. But the alternative bankruptcy disgrace, the dismantling of his life's work, made even this extortion seem preferable. You drive a hard bargain, Vega. Is that all? Gabriel stood buttoning his jacket with unhurried precision. One more thing. The Hudson Yards development, I want 15% ownership. Non-voting shares, but full profit participation. Charles finally lost his composure, standing abruptly. That project is worth nearly $400 million. You're demanding a $60 million stake for a spilled drink. Gabriel's voice remained perfectly level, but steel ran beneath the words. No, Mr. Harrington. I'm offering to save your $2 billion company for the price of $60 million in equity. Considering the alternative, I'd call that generous. Charles knew he was trapped. Every instinct screamed against capitulation, against showing weakness to an adversary. But the cold financial reality was undeniable. Gabriel Vega had engineered a situation where surrender was the only rational choice. I need 24 hours to discuss with my board to prepare Brandon. Gabriel nodded, checking his watch casually. 24 hours. After that, the terms change, and not in your favor. With that, Gabriel Vega departed, leaving Charles Harrington alone with the ruins of his pride and the dawning realization that he had catastrophically underestimated the restaurant owner from the beginning. Elena was waiting at their penthouse when Gabriel returned, anxiety evident in her posture as she paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows. She turned immediately when the elevator doors opened. How did it go? Gabriel removed his jacket, satisfaction evident in the relaxed set of his shoulders. Exactly as expected. He blustered, he threatened, he tried to buy me off. Then he realized his position and capitulated. Elena moved closer, searching his face for details. He agreed to our terms, all of them. Public apology, Brandon's permanent removal, the foundation endowment, even the ownership stake in Hudson Yards. Rather than the triumph she'd expected to feel, Elena experienced a wave of unease. This victory felt hollow, somehow tainted by the sheer force Gabriel had brought to bear against the Harringtons. What had begun as a quest for accountability had morphed into something that looked uncomfortably like vengeance. Isn't the ownership stake excessive? This started as standing up for dignity, for consequences. Now it feels like Gabriel's expression darkened slightly. Like what, Elena? Like punishment. Like making them pay. They tried to humiliate you, then blame you for your own humiliation. They deserve every consequence coming their way. The coldness in his voice sent a chill through Elena. This wasn't the Gabriel who had wooed her with homemade pasta and shy smiles. This was the shadow self he had promised to leave behind, the calculator of slights, the executor of retribution. When does it end, Gabriel? Where's the line between justice and revenge? Gabriel poured himself a Scotch, movements precise with contained energy. They're the ones who crossed the line, Elena. I just showed them the consequences of that choice. Elena moved to the window, staring out at the city below. From this height, people look like ants, cars like toys, a perspective that made it easy to forget the humanity of those you might crush beneath your feet. And what if they don't agree? What if Charles refuses your terms? Gabriel's reflection appeared beside hers in the window, his expression resolute. Then I destroy everything he's built. I call in the loans. I force bankruptcy. I acquire his projects in liquidation and dismantle the Harrington legacy piece by piece. The casual certainty with which he outlined this nuclear option shocked Elena. Despite knowing Gabriel's capacity for ruthlessness in business, she had never heard him speak so coldly about destroying another person's life work. That's not who we are. That's not who you promised to be. Gabriel's eyes met hers in the reflection, something ancient and implacable looking back at her. Sometimes, Elena, people only understand one language. Charles Harrington has spent his life using power to insulate himself and his son from consequences. Now he's learning how it feels to be on the receiving end of that equation. Elena turned to face him directly, suddenly understanding that this confrontation had awakened something in Gabriel that she had hoped was long buried, a capacity for calculated destruction that had served him in his youth, but had no place in the man she had married. I didn't ask for this, Gabriel. I wanted accountability, not annihilation. Gabriel's expression softened, slightly reaching to touch her cheek with genuine tenderness. I know him more. And if they accept our terms, that's all that will happen. Accountability, consequences change. But they needed to understand that rejection wasn't an option. Sometimes the threat of destruction is necessary to avoid having to destroy. Elena recognized the logic that had guided Gabriel through his earlier life, the belief that overwhelming force properly displayed prevented the necessity of its use. It was the logic of deterrence, of mutually assured destruction. But it left a bitter taste in her mouth to see it applied in what had begun as a personal matter. I want to be there when they make the public apology. I want to look Brandon Harrington in the eye when he acknowledges what he did. Gabriel nodded, a hint of pride returning to his expression. Of course, you deserve to witness it. They stood together as night fell over Manhattan, the city lighting up beneath them like a constellation of earthbound stars. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed some threshold in their marriage, that Gabriel had revealed a part of himself she had known existed but had never fully confronted. In pursuing justice for her humiliation, they had awakened sleeping dragons in both their lives. The question now was whether those dragons could be returned to slumber once they had served their purpose. The Harrington Development Group board meeting the following morning was a foregone conclusion. Charles presented Gabriel's terms without embellishment, laying out the dire alternatives in clinical detail. The board members, most longtime friends and associates, looked stunned, but not a single voice suggested resistance. The vote was unanimous, except Gabriel Vega's terms salvaged what remained of the company lived to fight another day. Brandon's signature on the resignation agreement proved more difficult to secure. After his explosive exit from their last conversation, he had holed up in his Hamptons estate, ignoring calls and surrounding himself with sympathetic friends who reinforced his sense of victimhood. Charles dispatched the company's chief legal counsel to the Hamptons, with clear instructions, explained to Brandon that his signature was non-negotiable, that the financial survival of Harrington Development Group depended on his compliance, and that his trust fund, while substantial, would evaporate if the company collapsed. The threat to his financial future finally penetrated Brandon's defenses. He signed the agreement with angry, jagged strokes, but extracted one concession: he wouldn't have to live in New York while fulfilling the terms. He could relocate to Miami, Los Angeles, London, anywhere beyond the daily humiliation of his fall from grace in Manhattan society. Charles agreed, perhaps recognizing that geographical distance might eventually lead to emotional healing for them both. The relationship was fractured, possibly beyond repair, but destroying his son served no purpose. Accountability didn't require annihilation, a distinction Charles hoped Gabriel Vega understood as well. The press conference was scheduled for noon 3 days later at Harrington Development Group's headquarters. The timing was deliberate, late enough for comprehensive preparation, soon enough to demonstrate commitment to the agreement. The location was symbolic, hosting the public reckoning in their own territory rather than neutral ground, accepting the home field disadvantage as part of the penance. Gabriel received confirmation of the arrangements with cool satisfaction. The pieces had fallen precisely as he'd orchestrated. Now came the public demonstration, the visible consequences that would transform Elena's humiliation into a statement about power, accountability, and the changing social contract between the privileged and those they often treated as invisible. Elena's preparations for the event were more emotional than practical. She selected a simple navy suit, professional, dignified, neither flashy nor submissive. Her attorney, Amelia Chen, would accompany her along with 2 other plaintiffs from the class action lawsuit. They would sit in the front row, visible reminders of the pattern that had necessitated this moment. Gabriel deliberately separated his arrival from Elena's understanding that this was her victory, not his. The financial pressure he'd applied had created the conditions, but the public accountability belonged to Elena and the other women who had spoken out. His role now was supportive rather than central, a reversal of the traditional power dynamics that had defined the conflict from the beginning. Camera lights cast harsh illumination across the Harrington Development Group headquarters press room. Once a space for triumphant announcements of billion-dollar developments, today it hosted a public reckoning. Journalists packed the rows, phones, recording notepads ready. The anticipation crackled in the air. They had come to witness something rare, the powerful facing consequences. Elena entered flanked by Amelia Chen and two other plaintiffs from the class action. She wore the simple navy suit, her posture straight, expression composed. No trace remained of the humiliated woman dripping with alcohol. The transformation wasn't just in her appearance, but in the energy she projected, dignified, resolute, unashamed. Cameras swiveled to capture her arrival, but she ignored them, taking a seat in the front row. Gabriel arrived separately, deliberately creating distance between them for this public moment. This wasn't about him or their marriage. It was about Elena reclaiming her narrative. He nodded almost imperceptibly as he passed her, his eyes conveying both pride and caution. The man who had orchestrated financial warfare against the Harringtons now appeared as merely a supportive husband, though everyone in the room who mattered knew better. The door behind the podium opened. Charles Harrington emerged first, his normally commanding presence diminished by circumstances. The tailored suit hung perfectly, as always, but new lines creased his face, dark circles shadowing his eyes from sleepless nights. Behind him trailed Brandon, visibly hungover despite efforts to appear presentable. His eyes darted around the room, flinching when they landed briefly on Elena before skittering away. Charles approached the microphone, adjusting it with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor. The room fell silent. "Thank you for coming. Harrington Development Group has called this press conference to address the incident that occurred at the Renaissance restaurant 6 weeks ago involving my son Brandon and Elena Vega." Charles paused, glancing at prepared notes before apparently deciding against using them. When he continued, his voice carried something rarely heard from him, genuine contrition. What happened that night was inexcusable. Brandon's behavior represented a profound failure of judgment, decency, and respect. As his father and as CEO of this company, I failed as well, first by not intervening during the incident, and later by attempting to minimize what occurred rather than addressing it honestly. Elena watched Charles carefully, searching for signs of insincerity, finding instead a man forced into painful self-reflection. Brandon stood behind his father, jaw clenched, eyes focused on some middle distance, visibly uncomfortable but trapped by circumstance. Charles continued, each word measured. "To Ms. Vega and the other women who have come forward with similar experiences, I offer my deepest apology. Not just for specific incidents, but for fostering a culture where such behavior could occur repeatedly without consequence. That ends today." He gestured for Brandon to step forward. The younger Harrington approached the microphone with obvious reluctance, his prepared statement trembling slightly in his hands. When he spoke, his voice lacked the contrition of his father's, revealing instead the petulant tone of someone going through motions against their will. "I apologize to Elena Vega for my actions at the Renaissance. My behavior was inappropriate and disrespectful." The perfunctory words hung in the air, their insufficiency obvious to everyone present. Charles shot his son a warning glance. Brandon cleared his throat, continuing with marginally more effort. "I also apologize to the other women who have come forward. Mira Jenkins, Alicia Williams, Tanya Rodriguez, and others. My pattern of behavior was wrong. I take full responsibility." Elena maintained her composure, though. Inside, she seethed at the obvious insincerity. Brandon was reading words he didn't believe, fulfilling obligations he didn't understand. The performance was almost worse than silence would have been, this pantomime of accountability without genuine recognition of harm. Charles reclaimed the microphone, perhaps sensing the damage his son's hollow apology was inflicting. "Words alone are insufficient. Therefore, effective immediately, Brandon Harrington has resigned from all positions within Harrington Development Group and its subsidiaries. He will have no future role in the company's management or operations." A murmur rippled through the press corps. This was more than the temporary leave of absence previously announced. Brandon's face flushed with humiliation and anger, hands clenching at his sides, but he remained silent. Additionally, Harrington Development Group is establishing a $50 million endowment for the Hospitality Worker Dignity Foundation, which will support service industry employees who experience harassment or discrimination. Elena Vega has agreed to serve as chairperson of the foundation's board. Cameras turned toward Elena, who acknowledged the announcement with a slight nod, her expression remaining deliberately neutral. The settlement had been finalized just hours earlier. The foundation had been her idea, transforming personal compensation into structural change. She had insisted on chairing the board herself, ensuring the funds would create genuine impact rather than serving as merely reputation laundering for the Harringtons. Charles continued outlining the company's commitments. New harassment policies, training programs, anonymous reporting systems. The corporate remedies flowed smoothly, rehearsed, and polished. But when questions began, the facade cracked. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal stood first. Mr. Harrington's sources suggest Harrington Development has experienced significant project delays and financial difficulties in recent weeks. Are these announcements related to those problems? Charles hesitated the question, probing directly at the unspoken leverage that had forced this moment of accountability. Before he could respond, another reporter called out, "Is it true that Gabriel Vega's investment groups have acquired controlling interest in your construction loans?" The direct reference to Gabriel's shadow campaign created a visible ripple of tension. Elena glanced toward her husband, who maintained an expression of mild interest, as though the question were merely curious rather than explosive. Charles gripped the podium slightly tighter. Today's announcements focus on addressing serious behavioral issues within our organization. Our company, like many in development, faces routine business challenges that we're managing appropriately. The deflection fell flat. Another reporter pressed further. "Brandon, how do you feel about being forced out of your family's company?" Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but Charles placed a warning hand on his arm. The gesture, captured by dozens of cameras, revealed the fragility of their united front. Before Charles could intercede, Brandon stepped forward, months of resentment finally boiling over. "How do I feel? I feel like I'm being sacrificed to save the company. One mistake, one drink, and suddenly I'm exiled." Meanwhile, Elena Vega's husband orchestrates a financial attack on our projects, and everyone pretends this is about justice rather than extortion. The room erupted. Charles attempted to regain control, but Brandon continued, color rising in his face. "Ask about the concrete suppliers that suddenly couldn't deliver. Ask about the union disputes that appeared overnight. Ask about the banks selling our loans to Gabriel Vega's shell companies. This isn't accountability, it's a shakedown." Elena maintained her composure even as cameras swung between her and Brandon like spectators at a tennis match. Gabriel shifted in his seat but remained silent, his expression unreadable. Charles finally managed to pull Brandon away from the microphone, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "My son speaks from emotion, not facts. Harrington Development takes full responsibility for the incidents that brought us here today. The press conference is concluded. Thank you." He practically dragged Brandon from the podium, their exit capturing none of the dignity Charles had hoped to salvage from the situation. As they disappeared through the door, the room exploded with questions and speculation. Reporters was already calling sources to investigate Brandon's claims. Amelia leaned toward Elena, whispering urgently, "This changes the optics considerably. Brandon just made this about money and power, not accountability." Elena nodded slightly, watching Gabriel across the room. His expression revealed nothing, but she knew him well enough to sense the calculation happening behind those eyes. Brandon's outburst had exposed aspects of Gabriel's campaign that were meant to remain invisible, the leverage that had forced the Harringtons to the table now visible for all to see. "Let's go. We've accomplished what we came for." Elena stood ignoring shouted questions as she made her way toward the exit. Gabriel fell into step beside her as they reached the corridor, his hand briefly touching the small of her back in a gesture of solidarity. Neither spoke until they were safely in the car, privacy glass raised between them and the driver. That didn't go as planned. Gabriel's understatement almost made Elena laugh despite the tension. Brandon's meltdown had transformed a carefully choreographed act of contrition into something messier and more revealing. "No, but maybe it's better this way." The apology was insincere, everyone could see that. At least now the truth is out in the open. Gabriel's expression darkened slightly. "Not the whole truth. Brandon made accusations without evidence. It complicates things." Elena studied her husband, recognizing the shift in his demeanor. The businessman was already calculating damage control, assessing exposure planning, countermoves. Sometimes she wondered if Gabriel ever truly stopped strategizing, if there was any moment when the weight of perpetual calculation lifted from his shoulders. "Does it matter? You got what you wanted." The Harringtons capitulated. "Brandon is out. The foundation is funded. You have your stake in Hudson Yards." Gabriel turned to her, genuine surprise crossing his features. "What I wanted, this was for you, Elena. Everything, all of it, was to get you justice." The sincerity in his voice was absolute. Whatever else Gabriel might be, whatever shadows his methods cast, his devotion to her remained his North Star. Elena reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I know, but justice feels different than I expected." The aftermath spread like wildfire. Financial reporters dug into Brandon's claims, uncovering connections between Gabriel's various business interests and the Harrington Project's problems. The New York Times published a detailed analysis of the construction loan acquisitions, tracing the shell companies back to entities associated with Taste of Legacy. CNBC ran a segment titled Restaurant Revenge, How Gabriel Vega Brought a Real Estate Empire to Its Knees. Elena watched the coverage with growing discomfort. What had begun as her story, her humiliation, her stand for dignity, had transformed into a business thriller about Gabriel's behind-the-scenes maneuvering. She had become a footnote in her own narrative, the wronged wife whose humiliation merely catalyzed a war between powerful men. Gabriel seemed unconcerned by the scrutiny, his legal team issuing carefully worded statements, neither confirming nor denying specific actions. Taste of Legacy maintains diverse investment holdings across multiple industries as part of a standard diversification strategy. The non-denials only fueled further speculation, business publications analyzing Gabriel's methods with a mixture of condemnation and grudging admiration. 1 week after the press conference, Gabriel was reviewing plans for a new restaurant location when his assistant announced an unexpected visitor, Charles Harrington, requesting a brief meeting with no aides or attorneys present. Gabriel's curiosity overcame his caution. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." Gabriel gestured toward a chair, studying Charles with mild interest. The developer had visibly deteriorated since the press conference, his normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, dark circles beneath his eyes, testifying to sleepless nights. "This isn't about business. I've signed the papers, transferred the funds, accepted your terms. This is about my son." Gabriel's expression revealed nothing, though inwardly he felt a flicker of surprise. Of all possible reasons for Charles's visit, concern for Brandon hadn't ranked high on his list of probabilities. What about him? Charles leaned forward, desperation bleeding through his carefully maintained facade. "He's spiraling, drinking constantly, making threats against you, against Elena, against me. I'm worried he might do something dangerous." Gabriel's posture shifted subtly, the latent protectiveness that defined his relationship with Elena immediately activated. "Are you suggesting Brandon poses a physical threat?" Charles ran a hand through his silver hair, the gesture betraying genuine fear rather than manipulation. "I don't know. He's never been like this before. The humiliation of the press conference, the loss of his position, it's broken something in him. He feels betrayed, cornered." Gabriel considered the information, weighing it against his understanding of Brandon. The younger Harrington had always struck him as a bully and a coward, the type who enjoyed power over those who couldn't fight back, but lacked the courage for direct confrontation with equals. Still, desperation could transform even the most predictable personalities. "Why come to me with this? Surely you have security resources." Charles's eyes met Gabriel's directly for perhaps the first time in their acquaintance, not as adversaries or negotiators, but as two men discussing a human problem beyond balance sheets and leverage. "Because you're the only one who might understand what I'm facing. We're not so different, Vega. We both built empires from nothing. We both protect what's ours at any cost." The comparison might have offended Gabriel in different circumstances, but the raw vulnerability in Charles's voice disarmed his usual defenses. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Charles hesitated, perhaps unsure himself of his purpose in coming. "I don't know. A truce, perhaps. Brandon sees you as the architect of his downfall. If he believed the pressure was lifting, that his exile might not be permanent, it might diffuse his anger." Gabriel's expression hardened, any momentary sympathy evaporating. "Your son humiliated my wife, then blamed her for it, then undermined his own apology with accusations and self-pity. His permanent removal wasn't a negotiating tactic, it was a necessary consequence." Charles nodded slowly, accepting the rejection with surprising dignity. "I understand, I had to try. He's my son, Gabriel, my only family." For a moment, looking at the broken man before him, Gabriel glimpsed a possible future version of himself, someone who had sacrificed everything for success, only to discover too late the emptiness of the achievement. The thought disturbed him more than he cared to admit. "I can't help with Brandon's position, but I can assure you that neither Elena nor I wish him physical harm. If he's making specific threats, I suggest you take appropriate precautions for his safety and others." Charles stood, the brief moment of vulnerability already receding behind his habitual mask of control. "I've never begged for anything in my life. I'm not starting now. But whatever you think of me, whatever you think of Brandon, remember that actions create ripples beyond our intentions. You won your war, Vega. Be careful what victory leaves in its wake." The warning lingered in Gabriel's mind long after Charles departed. Not a threat, but something more unsettling, a caution from someone who recognized in Gabriel a kindred capacity for single-minded pursuit of goals, regardless of collateral damage. It was the same quality that had allowed both men to build empires, but Charles's broken expression suggested the ultimate cost of such relentless ambition. That evening, Gabriel returned home earlier than usual, finding Elena preparing for her weekly cooking class for the women's shelter program. She looked up in surprise as he entered the kitchen, her hands covered in flour from the pasta dough she was testing. "You're home early. Everything okay?" Gabriel poured himself a glass of water, watching her work with practiced movements. The simple domesticity of the scene struck him with unexpected force. This woman kneading dough with the same determination she had shown standing up to the Harringtons building, something nourishing rather than tearing something down. "Charles Harrington came to see me today. About Brandon." Elena's hand stilled concern immediately crossing her features. "What about him?" Gabriel related the conversation, carefully observing Elena's reactions. As he described Charles's fears about Brandon's mental state, he noticed something shift in her expression. Not fear, but a complex empathy that both surprised and unsettled him. "Do you think he's actually dangerous or just lashing out?" Elena wiped flour from her hands, her practical nature asserting itself even in this unexpected situation. "I don't know." Charles seemed genuinely concerned, which suggests it's more than just attention-seeking behavior. "I've increased security at all our properties as a precaution." Elena nodded, accepting the measures without question. Years of marriage to Gabriel had accustomed her to such protocols, the invisible infrastructure of protection that surrounded their lives. But something else troubled her, a question she had been avoiding since the press conference. "Gabriel, if we had known from the beginning how this would unfold, Brandon's meltdown, the public exposure of your methods, Charles broken and afraid for his son, would you still have done it all the same way?" The question caught Gabriel off guard. Retrospection wasn't his natural mode. He moved forward, adapted to changing circumstances, but rarely second-guessed decisions once made. Elena's question forced him to consider not just outcomes, but intentions, the path as much as the destination. "I don't know. I wanted consequences for what happened to you. I wanted the Harringtons to understand they couldn't simply buy their way out of accountability. Beyond that," he trailed off, uncomfortable with the introspection. Elena watched him struggle, recognizing how rare it was to see Gabriel Vega without immediate answers. "I think that's the problem. We were so focused on making them pay that we never really considered where the path might lead. Now we have Brandon making threats, Charles begging for mercy, and our private business splashed across the financial press." Gabriel moved closer, taking her flour-dusted hands in his. "Do you regret it? Standing up to them? The lawsuit, the foundation?" Elena shook her head without hesitation. "Never. What happened at the Renaissance wasn't just about me. It represented something systematic, wealth and power used as shields against basic human decency. I'll always be proud of challenging that." Her certainty comforted him, but the underlying question remained. Had his methods effective as they were ultimately undermined the justice Elena had sought? Had his shadow campaign transformed a righteous stand for dignity into something that looked more like personal vendetta? Before he could pursue the thought further, his phone buzzed with a security alert. The system had detected someone attempting to access their building, someone matching Brandon Harrington's description, but using a service entrance typically reserved for deliveries. The security footage showed Brandon arguing with a guard, clearly intoxicated but determined to gain entry. Gabriel immediately activated enhanced security protocols, calling Mike Russo to bring additional personnel while instructing the building's security team to detain Brandon without escalation. Elena watched the security feed over Gabriel's shoulder, her expression shifting from initial alarm to thoughtful concern. "He came here directly after Charles warned you. That can't be coincidence." Gabriel nodded, his mind already mapping potential scenarios, threat assessments, response strategies. The security professionals he employed were well-trained, but instructed to use minimum force, a policy he suddenly hoped wouldn't be tested. "It's likely Charles told him about our meeting. Perhaps Brandon interpreted it as negotiation rather than warning." Elena studied the footage again, noting something Gabriel had missed in his security focus. Brandon wasn't displaying aggression toward the guards. Despite his intoxication, his body language suggested desperation rather than threat. "I want to talk to him." "Absolutely not. He's drunk, potentially dangerous, and explicitly came looking for confrontation." Elena's determination only strengthened the same quiet resolve that had carried her through the Renaissance incident and everything after. "He came here for a reason, Gabriel. Whatever closure he's seeking, whatever he needs to say, this might be our only chance to truly end this. Gabriel recognized the futility of argument when Elena had made up her mind. He contacted security, instructing them to bring Brandon to the private conference room adjacent to the lobby, a controlled environment with multiple exit points and security monitoring. I'll be with you the entire time. At the first sign of trouble, we end it. Elena nodded her agreement, though Gabriel suspected she had her own ideas about how the conversation should proceed. Together, they took the private elevator down Gabriel, texting Mike Russo to position additional security discreetly throughout the building. Brandon Harrington waited in the conference room, pacing erratically. His expensive clothes were disheveled, his appearance a stark contrast to the polished heir who had poured a drink on Elena weeks earlier. He spun toward the door as they entered, eyes wild and bloodshot. Finally, the power couple deigns to see me. The slurred words carried venom, but underneath Gabriel detected something else, a desperate, almost childish hurt. Elena stepped forward before Gabriel could intervene, her voice steady. Why are you here, Brandon? The direct questions seemed to momentarily disorient him, as though he'd prepared for rejection or aggression rather than simple inquiry. He swayed slightly, steadying himself against the conference table. Why am I here to see the people who destroyed my life? Congratulate them personally. Elena maintained eye contact, neither retreating nor advancing. Nobody destroyed your life, Brandon. Your actions had consequences. That's all. Brandon laughed bitterly, gesturing wildly at Gabriel. My actions. What about his financial warfare, corporate sabotage, market manipulation, all because I spilled a drink? Tell me how that's proportional. Gabriel tensed, ready to end the conversation, but Elena placed a subtle, restraining hand on his arm. It wasn't just a drink. It was deliberate humiliation. It was treating another human being as less than yourself. And it wasn't isolated, it was part of a pattern. Brandon's expression flickered between anger and something more vulnerable. Perhaps the first glimmer of genuine reflection he had experienced in his privileged life. So I'm a terrible person. Message received, but he's the one who crashed our company, stock paralyzed our projects, threatened financial ruin. Where are his consequences? The question hung in the air, its uncomfortable resonance impossible to dismiss entirely. Elena glanced at Gabriel, whose expression remained impassive despite the direct challenge. Gabriel acted to protect me, to create accountability when normal channels had failed. Was it extreme? Perhaps, but it came after decades of you facing no consequences whatsoever for similar behavior. Brandon collapsed into a chair, the manic energy suddenly draining from him. For the first time, Gabriel saw not the entitled heir, but a broken young man whose entire identity had imploded. You've won. Completely. I'm out of the company. My father barely speaks to me. The family name is toxic. What more do you want? The raw despair in his voice caught Elena off guard. She had prepared for threats, accusations, even violence, but not this naked vulnerability. She sat across from him, maintaining a safe distance, but deliberately placing herself at eye level. I don't want anything more from you, Brandon. I never did. I just wanted acknowledgement of what happened and assurance it wouldn't happen to someone else. Brandon stared at her, genuine confusion crossing his features. Then why all this? The lawsuit, the press, the financial attacks. If all you wanted was an apology, why destroy everything else? Elena considered the question carefully, recognizing its legitimacy despite the source. Because an apology without consequences isn't accountability, it's just words. For someone who has never faced repercussions, meaningful change requires meaningful impact. The simplicity of her explanation seemed to reach Brandon in a way that threats and force had not. He looked down at his hands, the trademark Harrington confidence entirely absent. So what? Now I'm just finished at 27. Gabriel spoke for the first time, his voice level but not unsympathetic. That's entirely up to you. Your father built his empire from nothing. You still have resources, education opportunities most people never see. What happens next depends on what you learn from this. Brandon looked up, studying Gabriel with newfound sobriety despite his intoxicated state. That's rich coming from you. The man who showed me exactly how ruthless a business can be. Maybe I should thank you for the lesson. Gabriel held his gaze without flinching. The difference is I know what I am, Brandon. I've never pretended otherwise. The question is whether you're ready to see yourself clearly. The confrontation Elena had feared never materialized. Instead, Brandon seemed to deflate further whatever purpose had driven him to their building, dissipating in the face of Elena's calm dignity and Gabriel's unflinching assessment. After a few more minutes of subdued conversation, Security escorted him out, not in restraints, but with the careful attention given to someone who might harm themselves rather than others. As they rode the elevator back to their penthouse, Elena leaned against Gabriel, suddenly exhausted. That wasn't what I expected. Gabriel's arms circled her shoulders, drawing her closer. What were you expecting? A rage? Threats? Instead, he just seemed lost. Gabriel considered this assessment, finding it aligned with his own impression. Brandon Harrington had arrived seeking catharsis through confrontation, but found himself disarmed by simple human recognition, Elena treating him not as a villain, but as a person facing the consequences of his actions. Sometimes the most devastating outcome isn't losing money or position. It's losing the story you've told yourself about who you are. The observation carried weight beyond Brandon's situation. Gabriel had built his life around certain narratives too: the self-made success, the legitimate businessman, the protector. Recent events had forced him to confront the contradictions in those identities, the places where shadow and light blurred within his own character. They entered their apartment, the familiar space feeling somehow different after the encounter, as though the boundaries between their carefully constructed life and the messier realities they had unleashed had thinned, becoming more permeable. Elena moved to the window, gazing out at the city lights emerging as dusk settled over Manhattan. Gabriel joined her, their reflections ghost-like against the darkening sky. Do you think he'll be okay? The question surprised Gabriel. Genuine concern for Brandon Harrington's welfare had never factored into his calculations. Yet Elena's capacity for empathy, even towards someone who had harmed her, reminded him of what had drawn him to her in the first place. Her fundamental humanity, so different from the transactional worldview that had shaped his early life. I don't know. He has resources most people don't, but he's never had to rebuild himself before. That takes a kind of strength money can't buy. Elena turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. And what about us? Where do we go from here? The question carried layers, not just their next practical steps, but the deeper direction of their lives together, the values that would guide them beyond this conflict that had consumed so much of their recent existence. The foundation launches next month. Your work with the women's shelter is expanding. My restaurants need attention after all the distractions. Gabriel listed practical matters, though he recognized they weren't truly addressing Elena's question. She waited patiently, allowing him the space to find his way to the heart of what she was asking. But beyond that, I think we need to decide what kind of power we want to wield in this city. The Harringtons use theirs as a shield, protecting themselves from consequences. I've used mine as a weapon when necessary. Maybe there's another way, using influence to build rather than control. Elena smiled slightly, recognizing the significance of Gabriel, even considering such a shift in perspective. From revenge to restoration. I'd like that. Gabriel pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, flour still dusting her clothes from the interrupted cooking preparation. In that moment, the empire he had built, the restaurants, investments, properties, the intricate web of influence extending across New York, seemed secondary to this simple connection. The realization both comforted and unsettled him. He had spent decades accumulating power, perfecting its application. Could he truly transform its purpose? Now the following months brought significant changes for all involved. Brandon Harrington, after a brief period of destructive behavior, checked into a rehabilitation facility in Arizona, whether from genuine desire for change or simply to escape public scrutiny remained unclear. His absence from New York society created its own ripples. Friends who had previously courted his favor moved on to other social circles. Nightclubs that had once reserved VIP tables found new patrons. His image gradually fading from the gossip columns that had once documented his exploits so faithfully. Charles Harrington focused on rebuilding Harrington Development Group's reputation and operations. The project delays had cost millions, but with Gabriel's pressure lifted, construction resumed on all 4 major developments. More surprisingly, Charles implemented significant governance changes, distributing decision-making power more broadly across the executive team, establishing an ethics committee with external membership, creating stronger mechanisms for addressing workplace concerns. Business analysts interpreted these moves as damage control, intended to stabilize the company after recent turmoil, but Elena suspected they represented something more personal, Charles confronting the costs of concentrated power and dynastic thinking that had protected Brandon at the expense of those he harmed. For Gabriel and Elena, the aftermath brought both professional evolution and personal reflection. The foundation consumed much of Elena's time and energy, though in ways she found deeply fulfilling. The boardroom of the Hospitality Worker Dignity Foundation occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, deliberately located away from Manhattan's financial district, physically embodying the foundation's commitment to serving communities rather than institutions. Around the table sat an unlikely coalition, former service workers, labor organizers, corporate representatives from the hospitality industry, and legal experts specializing in workplace rights. Charles Harrington was conspicuously absent, though his $50 million endowment had made the gathering possible. He had fulfilled his financial obligations but declined any role in the foundation's governance, perhaps recognizing that his presence would undermine its mission. Elena called the meeting to order, still adjusting to her role as chairperson. The position utilized skills from her restaurant management days, organization diplomacy, strategic thinking, but toward a purpose that resonated more deeply with her values. Welcome to the inaugural board meeting of the Hospitality Worker Dignity Foundation. Today we begin the work of transforming one incident of humiliation into thousands of opportunities for empowerment. She outlined the foundation's 3 core initiatives: legal defense funding for workers facing harassment, education programs for both employees and management, and economic support for those who lost employment after reporting abuse. The comprehensive approach reflected Elena's understanding that meaningful change required addressing both individual cases and systemic patterns. Gabriel had deliberately maintained distance from the foundation, concerned his involvement might taint its mission with associations to their private battle with the Harringtons. But he attended the first board meeting wanting to witness this new chapter's beginning from the periphery. How did it go? Elena joined him on a bench in the small garden behind the building after the meeting, concluded the late afternoon sun warming the brick walls around them. Productive. We approved the first round of grants, 23 workers who lost jobs after reporting harassment. The Legal Defense Fund launches next week. Gabriel nodded, genuine pride evident in his expression. While the foundation had originated from their conflict with the Harringtons, it had evolved into something independent and potentially transformative, Elena's vision taking shape beyond the circumstances of its creation. The reporters have stopped calling about our restaurant revenge saga. The market has moved on to fresher scandals. Elena smiled, slightly relieved the media frenzy had subsided. The weeks of intense scrutiny had been draining, their private conflict transformed into public spectacle, analyzed from every angle by people who understood the mechanics, but not the humanity of what had occurred. In Harrington development, Gabriel shrugged, his expression neutral. Stock has stabilized. Projects are moving forward again. Charles has implemented some interesting governance reforms, genuine changes, not just window dressing. The lack of satisfaction in Gabriel's tone caught Elena's attention. Throughout their campaign against the Harringtons, he had maintained a certain detachment, viewing each development as moves on a chessboard rather than emotional victories or defeats. Now, with the endgame achieved, she had expected at least some sense of triumph. You don't sound particularly pleased with the outcome. Gabriel considered her observations, searching for words to explain the complicated emotions he typically kept carefully contained. I achieved everything I set out to do, protected you, forced accountability, secured consequences. But somewhere along the way, the victory lost its sweetness. Elena reached for his hand, understanding dawning. Because you recognized yourself in Charles, the same capacity for single-minded pursuit regardless of collateral damage. Gabriel's fingers tightened around hers, the rare moment of vulnerability more meaningful for its scarcity. Perhaps, or maybe because true victory would mean Brandon actually changing, not just suffering. Charles finding peace, not just capitulation. Consequences that heal rather than just punish. The insight surprised Elena, this nuanced perspective, so different from the binary worldview that had defined Gabriel's earlier life. The man who had once seen the world as simply winners and losers, predators and prey, was evolving towards something more complex, and understanding that true power might lie in transformation rather than domination. That's the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is about making someone else suffer. Justice is about making the world better. Gabriel smiled slightly, recognizing the wisdom in her words. The unlikely journey from that night at the Renaissance, a simple service interaction transformed into a complex moral reckoning, had changed them both in ways neither had anticipated. The foundation Elena now led would support thousands of workers beyond herself. The confrontation with Brandon had created space for genuine reflection rather than merely inflicting punishment. Even Charles Harrington, after decades of operating from privilege and power, had begun reconsidering the structures he had built and perpetuated. As they walked together through Brooklyn streets now turning golden in the late afternoon light, Gabriel found himself contemplating the Renaissance, not just the restaurant where their conflict had begun, but the historical period of rebirth and renewal. Perhaps their own Renaissance was just beginning, their understanding of power and purpose, evolving beyond the lessons of their earlier lives. 6 months after the press conference, Gabriel and Elena received an unexpected communication, an invitation to the reopening of the Renaissance restaurant, now redesigned and rebranded, with a new mission statement emphasizing staff dignity and customer respect. More surprising than the invitation itself was its source, Charles Harrington, whose investment firm had quietly acquired the property after its previous management company dissolved following the scandal. The gesture wasn't quite reconciliation, but it suggested something more nuanced than continued enmity. Gabriel interpreted it as acknowledgement recognition of a new equilibrium between former adversaries, a tacit agreement that the war had ended, and both sides could now define the peace on their own terms. Elena decided to accept the invitation, curious to see how the space had been transformed, both physically and philosophically. Gabriel accompanied her with some reluctance, still wary of Charles's intentions, despite the apparent olive branch. The redesigned Renaissance retained its elegance, but had shed some of its exclusivity. The staff wore professional attire, but without the rigid formality that had once emphasized the separation between servers and served. The clientele remained upscale, but more diverse. Most notably, a plaque near the entrance outlined the establishment's commitment to a workplace culture based on mutual respect with clear protocols for addressing inappropriate behavior from staff or patrons. Charles Harrington greeted them personally, his manner neither overly warm nor coldly formal, the precise calibration of a man who had learned through painful experience that relationships could not be managed like balance sheets. "Thank you for coming. I wanted you to see what we've done with the place." The tour was brief but revealing. Charles had implemented many of the policies recommended by workplace consultants who specialized in hospitality environments: fair compensation structures, clear reporting channels for harassment or discrimination, regular training for staff at all levels. The changes weren't revolutionary, but they represented genuine effort rather than mere damage control. As they concluded the tour, Charles hesitated, clearly weighing his next words. "Brandon is doing better. 6 months sober, working with a therapist. It's a process." Elena nodded, appreciating the update without pressing for details. Gabriel remained silent, his expression neutral, but not hostile. The three stood for a moment in the same space where their conflict had begun, now transformed by both physical renovation and the less visible but more significant changes in their understanding of power and responsibility. The snow that had fallen that fateful night was long melted. Seasons had turned, wounds had begun to heal. Charles extended his hand first to Elena, then to Gabriel, not seeking forgiveness or offering friendship, but acknowledging a shared journey through conflict towards something resembling resolution. After a brief hesitation, they each accepted the gesture, closing a chapter without pretending it had never been written. The encounter lasted less than 30 minutes, but its significance extended beyond the immediate moment. Charles Harrington returned to rebuilding his company with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had seen the foundations of his life's work nearly destroyed. Gabriel and Elena walked back into the winter evening snow, beginning to fall lightly around them, echoing the night at the Renaissance months earlier. But unlike that evening of humiliation and its aftermath of retribution, this snow felt cleansing, covering the city, impossibility inviting new paths forward across unmarked terrain. Elena squeezed Gabriel's hand as they walked their footprints, the first to break the pristine surface. "What are you thinking about?" Gabriel looked at his wife, the woman whose dignity and resilience had catalyzed not just a confrontation with power, but a reconsideration of its purpose. "I'm thinking that sometimes the most powerful thing isn't winning the war. It's deciding what kind of peace to build afterward." Elena lifted her face toward the sky, snowflakes melting against her skin in tiny benedictions. Her voice quiet but resolved. Then let's build something worth the fight.